Ayaka was the most beautiful girl in the village, but her innate, breathtaking beauty only brought jealousy from others. During a year ravaged by devastating floods, the villagers decided to sacrifice her to the river god. At first, Ayaka thought it was just an ordinary prayer ceremony, and she agreed to it lightly, only to realize at the very end that she would have to pay with her life. In exchange for the rain to cease, she was supposed to die, but was instead granted a new life by a mysterious creature living in the marsh. For decades thereafter, Ayaka lived in the swamp, her body remaining forever young. One day, she encountered Ginko, who happened to pass by. He was a Mushishi. In this world, there exist supernatural beings called Mushi. When humans come into contact with Mushi, strange phenomena often occur, sometimes causing all kinds of problems. Mushishi are those who exist to resolve these problems. Both Ayaka and Ginko were surprised by each other's unusual hair color. Through their conversation, Ginko learned that Ayaka had been living in the swamp for a long time. At first, Ginko didn't quite believe her words, because it should be impossible for a human to survive in a swamp. But then he suddenly sensed the presence of Mushi. It turned out that Ayaka had been parasitized by a type of Mushi. These Mushi were colorless, odorless, and liquid in form. Once accidentally consumed by a human, the host would be forever unable to leave the water. Without intervention, they would eventually liquefy completely and merge back into nature. These Mushi were born in swamps and died in the sea. As their life came to an end, they would rush toward the ocean, and their human host would vanish along with them. Ayaka was deeply grateful that Ginko had told her all this, yet she did not fear death, because it was the swamp that had given her a second life. She was willing to become part of the swamp, to flow into the sea together. Before Ginko could say anything more, Ayaka slipped into the water and disappeared. Yet Ginko could still sense Ayaka's lingering desire to live. The next day, Ginko traveled downstream to seek help from a doctor named Mori at the spot where the underground river was destined to meet the sea. Ginko precisely located where the marsh water would pass. He then gathered the villagers downstream to help him set up a giant net overnight. Since these villagers had often received favors from Mori and Ginko, they were more than willing to assist. Moreover, saving a girl's life was seen as an act of great virtue. As night deepened, the swamp waters suddenly surged forward, coalescing into tentacle-like shapes resembling an octopus. At that moment, the swamp was actually a massive aggregation of countless Mushi. The terrified villagers mistook it for a sea monster and were about to stab at it with forks, but Ginko quickly shouted to stop them, preventing Ayaka from being harmed inside. The raging waves kept battering the fishing nets. In just under a minute, a great number of Mushi slipped through the net. The swamp entirely vanished without a trace, and the river returned to calm. However, Ayaka was nowhere to be found. Looking at the clothes she had left behind, Ginko guessed that perhaps she had merged into the Mushi completely, but he preferred to believe that Ayaka had entered the ocean and was now living freely like a fish. The next morning, the fishermen experienced a huge harvest and unexpectedly caught a mysterious young woman in their nets. Upon hearing the news, Ginko rushed over immediately. There he saw Ayaka, whose body had become completely semi-transparent. After a period of rest and recovery, Ayaka fully regained her health. For the first time, an overwhelming sense of clarity and freedom flooded her heart. Ginko's reappearance allowed Ayaka to be truly reborn. Not long after, Ayaka settled down in the village and became one of the villagers. She had once vowed to spend the rest of her life accompanying the swamp that gave her life. But now that the swamp had flowed into the sea, she too decided to live on. However, shortly after Ginko left, he discovered new swamps appearing throughout the forest. It turned out that the swamp had scattered seeds along its journey, silently nurturing numerous offspring without anyone noticing. Saito had the ability to foresee the future. At first, he intended to use it to help the villagers, but instead, he accidentally caused the death of everyone in the village. It all started when he began having strange dreams. For example, he once dreamed of finding a spring deep in the mountains. The next day, he actually dug up underground water at that very spot. Another time, he dreamed that the village was about to be hit by a natural disaster. Miraculously, he managed to save everyone. This incredible power of foresight led the villagers to revere Saito as a god. They obeyed his every word and brought him generous gifts every day. Until one day, Ginko came to see Saito. Ginko told him that the reason he had this power was because a type of mushi had parasitized his dreams. This mushi allowed him to foresee the future through his dreams, but it also reproduced within his dreamscape, causing him to dream more and more frequently, until he would eventually lose himself completely in his dreams. Ginko gave Saito some medicine, which could suppress the frequency of his dreams, but warned him that the medicine should only be used when the dreams became overwhelmingly frequent, or it would become toxic. Before leaving, Ginko promised Saito that he would return when the medicine was nearly gone. However, faced with the villagers' generous offerings and their heartfelt expectations, Saito couldn't bear to disappoint them. Gradually, he began to dream more and more often. His wife believed it was a gift from the heavens, allowing him to bring happiness to the village. But deep down, Saito was filled with fear, always feeling as though something terrible was about to happen. Eventually, he began taking the medicine Ginko had given him. Soon after, a massive tsunami struck the village, destroying countless homes. Even his daughter was tragically killed. The once respectful villagers now whispered behind his back, blaming him for not foreseeing the disaster, as if it had all been his fault. Saito fell into deep self-loathing. After that, he stopped taking the medicine. From that day on, he dreamed even more frequently, and his ability to foresee the future became even sharper. The villagers once again regarded him as a god. Everything seemed to be getting better, until one day, Saito had a nightmare. The scenes he witnessed were terrifying beyond imagination. He didn't even dare tell his wife, praying silently that the nightmare would not come true. But the next day, it became reality. He watched helplessly as his wife died in front of him. Then, one by one, the villagers' bodies began to crumble and disintegrate like soil. Saito could do nothing but watch it all unfold. He was powerless to stop it. In the end, he was the only one left in the entire village. 1 year later, Ginko returned, but by then, only Saito remained. After all he had been through, Saito finally understood. Ginko had deceived him from the very beginning. The mushi inside him did not grant the ability to foresee the future. It turned his dreams into reality. Everything he had prophesied up until now was, in fact, caused by his own hands. Now that the truth was out, Ginko no longer tried to hide it. He told Saito that these mushi could not be completely eradicated. They would continue to coexist with Saito, but once Saito learned the truth, he would no longer be able to control his thoughts, leading him to have even more horrifying dreams. And eventually, he would be driven to suicide. That was why Ginko had given him the medicine in the first place, to suppress the frequency of his dreams. Mushi usually reside within the host's dreams, but sometimes they can cross over into reality, turning dreams into the real world. As they continue to reproduce, their influence on reality grows stronger and stronger. However, they need a medium to bridge dreams and reality, and that medium was the key to destroying them. After that, Ginko tirelessly searched through ancient texts, trying to find a way to save Saito, but he didn't notice that Saito had disappeared. When Ginko finally found him, Saito had already consumed all of the medicine, hoping to use its toxicity to end his own life. Although Ginko managed to feed him an antidote just in time, Saito still fell into a coma. His eyes moved rapidly beneath his closed lids, as if he was dreaming again. Suddenly, a loud noise filled the room. On the folding screen, Saito's dream was projected. In the dream, the sky was filled with countless mushi. Saito didn't understand why he was there. Then he saw his family home. He walked inside and, to his shock, found his daughter, alive and well. His wife stood beside her, smiling gently. Saito completely broke down. He hugged his wife and daughter tightly, apologizing over and over again, but the very next second, they vanished. Saito found himself back in his room, staring at another version of himself lying on the bed. At that moment, the folding screen suddenly caught fire. The flames spread to the pillow in the dream, and the real pillow in the room also caught fire. Ginko immediately realized that the pillow was the medium the mushi were using to travel between dreams and reality. He hurriedly dragged Saito outside and ran to fetch water to extinguish the fire. By then, Saito understood everything completely. He remembered what Ginko had once told him. The medium was the key to destroying the mushi. At that moment, hatred overwhelmed his heart. He grabbed a samurai sword lying nearby, determined to avenge his wife, daughter, and the villagers. By the time Ginko realized what he was about to do and tried to stop him, it was too late. Saito slashed the pillow with one swift strike. Instantly, a deep wound appeared on his own body. Fortunately, Ginko was able to stop the bleeding in time. Thanks to the efforts of a doctor, Sato's life was saved. Although the Mushi had been destroyed, Sato's heart had already died. Inside the seashell, there was a strange little bird. Out of curiosity, Lia listened to its chirping. The moment she finished listening, she instantly lost consciousness. Fortunately, her friends found her in time and woke her up. Just as Lia was about to thank them, she was horrified to discover that she could no longer speak. Before she could figure out what was happening, her father suddenly rushed over and yanked her away, sternly warning her not to play with the other children anymore. He didn't even notice that his daughter had lost her voice. Luckily, Ginko happened to be passing through, and immediately noticed that something was wrong with Lia. It turned out that inside the seashell was a special kind of mushi. They usually hover over the ocean, feeding on seaweed. When they sense an impending change in the sea, they collectively hide inside seashells to escape disaster. During this time, the mushi emit faint chirps, calling their companions to hurry ashore. If a human listens to their chirping too closely, they will temporarily forget how to speak. Fortunately, the cure is simple: just listen to others talk, and the ability to speak will soon return. Earlier, Ginko had already found a large number of mushi on the beach. He realized that a disaster was about to strike the area, and he informed Lia's father, Tsunakichi. He hoped Tsunakichi would warn the villagers. However, Tsunakichi seemed to harbor deep resentment against the villagers. Helpless, Ginko decided to warn the villagers himself. But when he tried to alert them to the disaster, the village chief, Yoshio, didn't take it seriously at all. It turned out that under Yoshio's leadership, the villagers had already abandoned fishing at sea, and instead developed aquaculture along the shore. He made this decision because of a painful tragedy 10 years ago. At that time, a woman working on Yoshio's boat was attacked by a shark. Yoshio didn't save the woman right away, but instead prioritized rescuing his own wife. The woman was Tsunakichi's wife. This was the root of Tsunakichi's deep hatred toward the villagers, and why he forbade his daughter from associating with other children. Since then, Yoshio had pinned his hopes on aquaculture. He believed that as long as they stayed off the ocean, such tragedies would never happen again. That night, Ginko went to check the beach, and saw that the mushi were growing more and more dense. He realized that the impending disaster might be far worse than he had anticipated. The next day, Yoshio specifically went to Tsunakichi's house, wanting to inform him about the coming disaster, but Tsunakichi gave him the cold shoulder. Out of guilt, Yoshio had always wanted to help the father and daughter. He had invited Tsunakichi many times to join the aquaculture business, but Tsunakichi could never bring himself to forgive. That day, Tsunakichi and Liao went down to the sea as usual to collect shells. After a full day of work, they found only a few shells. However, Liao managed to find a pearl among them. That single pearl could be sold for a fortune. So, Tsunakichi placed the bag containing the pearl around his daughter's neck, thinking that even if something were to happen to him, Liao could survive in the world thanks to this pearl. Late at night, Ginko suddenly noticed that the mushi on the beach had gone completely silent. All of them had burrowed deeply into their shells. He immediately realized that the disaster was imminent, and rushed to inform Yoshio, telling him to organize the villagers to evacuate to higher ground immediately. The sea surface reflected eerie lights, and upon closer inspection, it was filled with countless dead fish floating on the water. As the sun rose, a blood-red red tide slowly appeared over the sea, devouring all marine life in its path. The fish fry the villagers had raised were completely wiped out. Seeing the fruits of their hard labor destroyed, Yoshio broke down and wept bitterly. In that moment, Tsunakichi finally understood that the tragedy at sea 10 years ago was just like the red tide before them, an unavoidable natural disaster, not something a human could control. He realized he should not have let Yoshio bear all the blame alone. A few days later, the red tide finally receded, but Lia's voice still hadn't returned. Ginko suggested that she listen to others talking more often. After bidding farewell to the father and daughter, Ginko was about to leave, when he was surprised to discover that the mushi were still hiding inside the shells. Normally, they should have returned to the sea along with the retreating red tide, unless the disaster wasn't truly over yet. Now that the aquaculture business had been destroyed, Yoshio had no choice but to lead the fishermen back out to sea. As they prepared to set sail, Tsunakichi suddenly appeared and blocked their way. Yoshio also understood that it was extremely dangerous to go fishing at this time, but for the sake of survival, they had no other choice. If they didn't go to sea, they would starve to death. At that moment, Tsunakichi had his daughter take out the small bag. When Yoshio looked inside and saw the pearl, he was utterly shocked. He knew full well the immense value of that pearl. Yoshio felt it was far too precious, but Tsunakichi calmly said, "Nothing is more precious than human life."